Chapter 1. The night Martin Vale brought his mistress home, he asked his wife to pour her a drink. For 3 full seconds, Helen Moore stood in the doorway of her own dining room and wondered if grief could make a person hallucinate. The table was set for 2. White candles, roast chicken cooling under foil, a bottle of red wine breathing beside the crystal glasses she only used on anniversaries. 24 years of marriage had taught Helen not to expect flowers anymore, but she had still cooked his favorite dinner because old habits did not die just because love had been starving. Then Martin walked in with a young woman on his arm. She was blonde, polished, and 29 at most, wearing a cream silk dress that looked too delicate for winter and a smile too confident for a guest who had never been invited. Her hand rested on Martin's sleeve as if it had belonged there for years. Martin did not look embarrassed. That was the part that made Helen's chest go cold. He took off his coat slowly, handed it to Helen as if she were the help, and said, "Helen, this is Brielle Stone. She will be staying for dinner." The young woman stepped into the warm light and looked around the room with open appraisal. Her gaze moved over the old portraits, the polished silver, the blue china Helen had washed by hand for 2 decades. Then Brielle smiled. "So this is the house," she said. Martin said it had charm. Charm, not home. Helen's fingers tightened around Martin's coat. The wool was still cold from outside. There was a faint trace of Brielle's perfume on the collar, sweet and sharp, the same scent Helen had noticed on her husband's shirts for 3 months. She had asked once. Martin had smiled at her across the bathroom mirror and said it was from a client who hugged everyone. Now that client stood in Helen's dining room, touching the back of Helen's chair. "That is my seat," Helen said. Her voice was calm, too calm, even to herself. Brielle looked at Martin first, as if asking whether the old wife was allowed to speak. Martin gave a small, impatient sigh. "Helen, don't make this difficult." Brielle pulled the chair out anyway and sat. She crossed her legs under Helen's table, lifted Helen's wine glass, and examined the rim. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "Martin told me you were practical, not sentimental." Helen looked at her husband. Martin was 52, handsome in the cold, expensive way that had helped him win courtrooms, boardrooms, and dinner tables for most of his adult life. His dark hair had silver at the temples now, but he wore age like a decoration. His suit was charcoal. His tie was loose. His expression carried the exhausted superiority of a man who had already forgiven himself. He placed a folder on the table. Divorce papers. Not hidden, not softened, not delayed until after dinner. Right there, beside the chicken she had spent 2 hours making. Helen did not move. Martin tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "I need you to sign these." Brielle lowered the glass slowly, her lips curved. "Tonight?" Helen asked. "Yes. On our anniversary?" Martin's mouth tightened, not with guilt, but irritation. "That is exactly why I chose tonight. We should stop pretending." The candles trembled in the draft from the hall. Helen noticed that, because if she did not notice something small, she might notice the sound of her own life breaking. Martin opened the folder and turned it toward her. "You will keep a generous settlement. The townhouse. Your personal savings. I am not cruel." The words landed with such absurdity that Helen almost laughed. Not cruel. He had brought another woman into the home where his wife had raised their son, sat that woman in her chair, and placed divorce papers beside an anniversary dinner. Not cruel. Brielle leaned back, one hand resting near the wine glass. "Martin has been very fair. Most women in your position would be grateful." Helen looked at her then. Really looked. Brielle had the kind of beauty that expected immediate reward. Smooth skin, pale hair, carefully parted lips, a diamond pendant small enough to seem tasteful and large enough to be noticed. But beneath the beauty, Helen saw calculation. The young woman was watching the room the way a buyer watched a property before making renovations. "My position," Helen repeated. "Well." Brielle gave a soft laugh. "You had a long run." Something inside Helen went still. Not numb, not broken. Still. Martin pushed a pen across the table. "Brielle and I are serious," he said. "I know this is painful, but you have to accept reality. I need someone beside me who understands the life I am building now. The old life was comfortable, Helen, but comfortable is not enough." Helen looked at the pen. 24 years earlier, Martin had signed their marriage license with trembling fingers because he had been young, broke, ambitious, and terrified of failure. She had believed in him then. She had worked 2 jobs while he studied for the bar. She had ironed his shirts before interviews, edited his early briefs, hosted dinners for clients who never remembered her name, and smiled through evenings where powerful men praised Martin for the stability she quietly created behind him. Comfortable, he called it, as if comfort had walked into his life on its own and set the table. "There is one condition," Helen said. Martin blinked. He had expected tears, perhaps a scene, perhaps begging. Not a condition. What condition? Helen picked up the papers and turned the pages with careful hands. Her eyes moved quickly. Settlement, property division, confidentiality, waiver. She paused at a clause involving the old Ashbourne estate, a property she had inherited through her father but never cared much about. Martin wanted her to sign away any future claim tied to the surrounding land parcels. There it was. Her pulse slowed. Martin had never cared about her father's old house. Not once in 24 years. Now he wanted it buried inside the divorce agreement. "I want my own attorney to review this," Helen said. Martin's eyes hardened. "There is no need. Then there is no signature." Brielle's smile thinned. "Helen, dragging this out will not make him choose you." Helen turned to her. "I was not speaking to you." The room snapped quiet. For the first time that evening, Brielle's expression slipped. A flash of anger crossed her face, quick and ugly. Martin stepped forward. "Do not talk to her that way." Helen stared at him. So there it was. 24 years of loyalty had earned her cold instructions. 3 months of perfume and lies had earned Brielle protection. Helen closed the folder. "I will have my lawyer call yours tomorrow." Martin's jaw flexed. "Helen, tomorrow." Brielle rose from the chair. Her cheeks were faintly red now, but she recovered quickly. She picked up Helen's anniversary wine glass and took a small sip. "Keep the house if you need it," she said softly. "Martin and I will buy something brighter." Helen looked at the lipstick mark Brielle left on the rim. Then she took the glass from Brielle's hand, walked into the kitchen, and poured the wine down the sink. When she came back, Martin was staring at her as if she had slapped someone. Helen placed the empty glass on the table. Dinner isn't left with Brielle 15 minutes later. He did not take the divorce papers. He left them on the dining table like a threat. Helen waited until the headlights vanished from the driveway before she allowed herself to sit, not in the chair Brielle had taken. She sat at the far end of the table where she could see the whole room, the cold chicken, the dying candles, the folder, the 2 untouched plates. Her hands were steady. That frightened her more than crying would have. For years, Helen had imagined that if Martin ever betrayed her, she would collapse. She thought grief would be dramatic. A shattered glass. A scream. A body on the floor. Instead, she felt a clean, terrible clarity. The marriage was not dying tonight. It had died slowly, quietly. In all the years Martin stopped asking how she slept. It had died each time he turned his face away when she reached for him in bed. It had died at charity dinners where he introduced her as "my wife," with the same tone he used for my coat. It had died in the silence after their son left for college. When Helen discovered she had spent her entire adult life listening to Martin talk and could not remember the last time he had listened back. Tonight was not the death. Tonight was the body being named. At 2 a.m, Helen carried the divorce folder upstairs and opened the locked cedar chest at the foot of the guest bed. Inside were old tax records, family photographs, her son's kindergarten drawings, and a cream envelope her father had given her before he died. She had not opened it in 2 years. Her father, Arthur Moore, had been a quiet man with rough hands and patient eyes. The town had known him as a clock repairer. He drove a brown station wagon, wore patched sweaters, and kept peppermint candies in his jacket pocket for children who came into his shop. He had never seemed rich. He had never seemed poor either. He seemed separate from the question. On his last clear afternoon, he had pressed the envelope into Helen's palm. "When the room gets too small," he had whispered, "call the number inside." At the time, she thought he meant grief. Now she opened it. Inside was a business card, yellowed slightly at the edges. Eleanor Price, Managing Counsel, Ashbourne Capital Trust. There was a handwritten note beneath it. "Helen, if you are reading this because someone has made you feel powerless, good. It means you are finally ready to know you are not." Her breath caught. The note continued. "Call Eleanor. Do exactly what she says. Trust no document Martin puts in front of you until she has read it." Helen sat very still. Her father's handwriting was small, slanted, unmistakable. Trust no document Martin puts in front of you. Not if Martin. Not anyone. Martin. Her father had known. At 7 the next morning, Helen called the number. Eleanor Price answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Vale," she said. Helen stood in the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes. "You know who I am?" "Yes. My father told me to call you." There was a brief silence, not surprise, but preparation. "Did your husband ask you to sign anything?" Helen looked at the divorce folder on the table. "Yes." "Did you sign?" "No." Eleanor exhaled softly. "Good. Do not sign anything. Do not send him a text. Do not answer questions about your father's property. I will be at your house in 2 hours." Helen looked out the window. Dawn was lifting over the bare trees. The world looked ordinary, almost insulting in its calm. "What is this about?" she asked. Eleanor's voice was steady. "Your father built something very large, Helen. He spent 40 years making sure no one could take it from you before you were ready to stand inside it." 2 hours later, Eleanor Price arrived in a black sedan with tinted windows and a leather case handcuffed to her wrist. She was in her 60s, tall, silver-haired, and sharp enough to make the air around her seem organized. She took off her gloves in Helen's entryway and looked briefly at the dining room table. The divorce folder was still there. Eleanor's face did not change, but her eyes cooled. "May I?" Helen handed it to her. Eleanor read for 12 minutes without sitting down. Then she closed the folder with one finger. "This is not a divorce agreement," she said. Helen's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "A theft attempt wearing a suit." For the first time since Martin had walked in with Brielle, Helen felt something hot move under her ribs. Eleanor opened her case. Documents emerged one by one. Trust charts, property maps, corporate structures, deeds, investment summaries. Names Helen had never heard, and one name she knew too well. Moore Holdings, Ashbourne Capital Trust, a private land portfolio across 6 states. A controlling interest in 2 commercial development funds, silent stakes in medical buildings, legal infrastructure, rural broadband, and civic construction projects. Helen stared at the papers until the words blurred. "My father repaired clocks," she said. Eleanor looked at her gently. "Your father repaired clocks because he loved clocks." "And this?" "This was what he built after everyone underestimated him." Helen sat down slowly. Eleanor placed one final document in front of her. Arthur Moore was the sole founder of Ashbourne Capital. After his death, voting control transferred into protective custody until you either requested activation or faced a qualifying threat to marital property. Your husband's filing triggers that clause. Helen read the number twice because the first time, her mind refused it. Net asset value, conservative estimate, $3.3 billion. She pressed her palm to the table, the same table where Martin had told her she had become too small for his life. "That cannot be real," she whispered. "It is real," Eleanor said, "and your husband knows part of it." Helen looked up. Eleanor tapped the clause in Martin's divorce papers. "The Ashbourne estate sits on a corridor needed for the North Line Civic Redevelopment Project. Martin's firm is trying to represent one of the bidder groups. If he can get you to waive future claims, he can help them acquire access without disclosing your ownership." Helen thought of Martin's impatience, Brielle in her chair, the anniversary timing, the way he had pushed the pen toward her. It had not only been cruelty, it had been strategy. He brought her here, Helen said slowly, because he thought humiliation would make me sign faster. Eleanor said nothing. She did not need to. Helen looked down at her father's note again. Someone has made you feel powerless. Good. She folded the note carefully and placed it beside the divorce papers. What happens now? She asked. Eleanor's mouth curved, barely. Now, Mrs. Vale, you stop being Mrs. Vale. Pointed him. Men like Martin Vale understood tears, anger, pleading, slammed doors. Those reactions kept him at the center of the room. Silence unsettled him because silence meant the other person might be thinking. For 2 weeks, Helen gave him nothing. His lawyer emailed. Eleanor responded. Martin called. Helen let it ring. He sent one message at midnight. Do not make this uglier than it has to be. Helen read it while sitting in a conference room at Ashbourne Capital's private office in Hartford, surrounded by attorneys, asset managers, and project directors who stood when she entered. She deleted the message. No reply. Across the table, Eleanor was explaining the Northline project. It was larger than Helen had imagined. A mixed civic development across 3 towns, a children's hospital wing, affordable senior housing, a transportation hub, a public library, and commercial space designed to fund maintenance for the public side. The kind of project her father would have loved, because it made money serve something beyond itself. Martin's law firm, Vale, Mercer & Klein, wanted the legal advisory contract. Brielle Stone was not just Martin's mistress. She was a junior partner candidate at the same firm. The Northline contract would make her career. If the firm landed it, Martin would become managing partner by summer, and Brielle would be promoted with him. Helen studied the file. So he did not just leave me for her, she said. Eleanor looked at her. He planned to build their future with my land. No one answered too quickly. That told Helen enough. A young analyst named Nadia turned a tablet toward her. On screen was a photograph from a hotel lobby security camera. Martin and Brielle entering the Belrose Hotel together 8 months earlier. We found expense records, Nadia said. Some were billed to client development. Helen's face stayed composed. Inside, something old and tender folded itself away for the last time. 8 months. While she had been planning Thomas's graduation dinner, while Martin had forgotten her birthday and blamed trial preparation. While she had stood in a department store holding 2 ties, wondering which one would make him look most confident at a conference where he had already planned to sleep with another woman. Nadia swiped again. Emails. Calendar entries. A draft internal memo naming Martin as proposed lead counsel for Ashbourne's Northline contract. Another memo recommending Brielle for partner track after acquisition. Helen read the subject line. Strategic family asset transfer. The room seemed to sharpen around her. Family asset, she said quietly. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the screen. That appears to refer to your estate. Helen laughed once. It had no humor in it. My father's estate. Yes. My son's inheritance. Potentially. Helen looked at the frozen image of Martin and Brielle in the hotel lobby. Brielle's face was turned up toward him. Martin's hand was at her back. They looked pleased with themselves, wrapped in that private glow people wore when they believed no one important could see them. Helen touched the edge of the tablet and pushed it back. Invite them, she said. Eleanor tilted her head. To what? The Northline announcement gala. The project director across the table shifted. We plan to announce the trust transition privately first. No, Helen said. Her voice was not loud, but every person in the room went still. She had spent 24 years making her opinions softer, so Martin would not feel challenged. She had wrapped intelligence in gentleness, wrapped hurt in patience, wrapped anger in silence, until she nearly disappeared beneath her own good manners. She was finished disappearing. My father built this in silence, Helen continued. I respect that. But Martin counted on my silence. Brielle counted on my shame. They walked into my home and tried to make me feel too small to read a contract. She looked at Eleanor. So let them come to the gala. Let them arrive believing they are about to win. I want them seated close enough to see every face turn when they realize who owns the room. For the first time that morning, Eleanor Price smiled fully. Your father would have enjoyed you. Helen looked down at Arthur Moore's old signature on the trust documents. After 4, Brielle Stone loved mirrors. She loved reflective elevator doors, polished car windows, restaurant glass, phone screens gone dark between notifications. Anything that gave her proof that the world was still arranged correctly, with her face at the center of it. On the morning the North Line invitation arrived, she stood in Martin's office at Vail, Mercer and Klein, and watched herself open the cream envelope. Ashbourne Capital Trust, she read aloud, letting each word taste expensive. Formal announcement gala. Grand Hartwell Hotel. Black tie. Martin looked up from his desk. Good. Good? Brielle turned, eyes bright. Martin, this is the room. This is the room where people stop calling me ambitious like it is an insult. He smiled, but the expression was strained. Helen's silence had bothered him more than he admitted. The divorce was moving, but not quickly. Her new attorney had challenged 3 clauses, demanded full financial disclosure, and blocked any transfer involving the Ashbourne estate. Helen had never cared about documents before. That was inconvenient. Still, Martin told himself it did not matter. Helen was hurt. Hurt people delayed. Eventually, she would sign. She had always chosen peace over battle. Brielle came around the desk and sat on the edge, close enough that her knee brushed his. Will she be there? Martin's face changed. Helen? Who else? No. Are you sure? Ashbourne Capital is not inviting my wife to a development gala. Brielle smiled at the word wife. Ex-wife. Almost. Say it correctly, Martin sighed. Almost ex-wife. She leaned down and kissed him, satisfied. There was a knock at the door. Before Martin could answer, his senior partner, Nolan Mercer, stepped in. He was a broad man with a courtroom voice and the permanent complexion of someone who drank too much expensive scotch. His gaze flicked to Brielle, seated on Martin's desk. Careful, Nolan said. Glass offices are not confessionals. Brielle slid off the desk with a smile that pretended not to be a retreat. Nolan held up his own invitation. Ashbourne is going public with the transition. If we land Northline, we control the region for 10 years. Martin nodded. I know. Do you? Nolan's voice sharpened. Because I hear your divorce is making noise. Brielle's smile disappeared. Martin stood. It is handled. Your wife owns a parcel we need. She will sign. She has not. Martin's eyes cooled. She will. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Make sure she does. I do not care who you sleep with. I care who signs. He left. The office door closed with a soft click. Brielle wrapped her arms around herself. That was rude. That was business. No, she said, turning on him. That was him treating me like a risk. Martin rubbed his forehead. Then stop acting like one. Her face hardened. For one dangerous second, he saw what lived under the silk and perfume. Hunger. Not love. Not loyalty. Hunger. Then Brielle smiled again. Fine, she said. I will behave perfectly at the gala. I will smile. I will charm everyone. I will make them see exactly why you chose me. Martin nodded, relieved. Brielle picked up the invitation. And if Helen does show up somehow, she will not. But if she does, Martin looked through the glass wall of his office at the city beyond it. Then she will see the life she was never built for. Brielle's smile returned. Good. It happened outside the courthouse on a wet Thursday morning. The sky was low and gray. Reporters gathered on the steps for a separate corruption trial, their cameras pointed away from the quiet divorce conference inside. Helen wore a dark green coat, her hair pinned low, a leather folder in one hand. Eleanor walked beside her. Martin was waiting near the entrance with his lawyer. Brielle was with him. Of course she was. She wore white again, this time a fitted coat with gold buttons and boots too high for the weather. When she saw Helen, she whispered something to Martin that made him glance up sharply. Helen kept walking. Helen, Martin said. She stopped because Eleanor stopped, not because he called. Martin's eyes moved over her coat, her calm face, the attorney at her side. Something like annoyance crossed his expression. This is unnecessary. Helen waited. The lawyers, he clarified. The delays. The financial demands. You are embarrassing both of us. Brielle let out a soft laugh. Mostly you. Eleanor's gaze moved to her with surgical precision. Brielle lifted her chin. Helen said, "Are you attending all our legal meetings now?" Martin asked me to come. No, Helen said. He allowed you to. Brielle's nostrils flared. Martin stepped between them slightly. Enough. Helen, I am trying to give you dignity. That did it. Not anger. Almost wonder. Helen looked at the man she had loved for half her life and realized he genuinely believed dignity was something he had the authority to distribute. Keep it, she said. Martin frowned. What? Your version of dignity? It seems expensive and poorly made. Eleanor's mouth twitched. Brielle's face flushed. Martin lowered his voice. Do not start speaking to me like you are someone else. Helen stepped closer. Rain gathered in fine beads on her coat collar. Her voice stayed quiet. That is your mistake, Martin. I am not someone else. I am exactly who I always was. You just never paid enough attention to be accurate. For a moment, he had no answer. Brielle recovered first. She looked Helen up and down, then smiled. You should come to the Ashbourne Gala, she said. If you can get in, it might help you understand why Martin needed a different life. Helen looked at her. Brielle's smile widened. A room like that has a language. Not everyone speaks it. Eleanor opened the courthouse door. Helen walked past Brielle without replying. Behind her, she heard Martin mutter, Let it go. Brielle answered softly, I just want her to know. Helen stepped inside the courthouse and felt no need to turn back. Brielle. The Grand Hartwell Hotel had been built for people who liked to believe wealth was a form of weather. Its marble lobby gleamed under chandeliers the size of small boats. Velvet ropes guided guests toward the ballroom. Men in black suits moved with earpieces and quiet authority. Women in gowns crossed the floor, in flashes of jewel tones, diamonds, and expensive restraint. At 7:15, Martin Vale arrived with Brielle Stone on his arm. Brielle wore red. Not wine red, not burgundy. A sharp, bright, camera-hungry red that announced itself before she spoke. Her hair was swept high, her lips matched the dress, and around her throat glittered a diamond necklace Martin had bought with money he had once told Helen they needed to save for taxes. Martin wore a black tuxedo and the controlled smile of a man entering a room he intended to own. For 30 minutes, everything went the way Brielle had imagined. People noticed her. Men looked twice. Women looked once and then again more carefully. Martin introduced her as Brielle Stone from Vale, Mercer, and Klein, and if anyone paused at the absence of Helen's name, Brielle filled the silence with charm. Martin and I are very excited about the future, she told Nolan Mercer near the champagne table. Nolan's smile was thin. The future tends to arrive with invoices. Brielle laughed too loudly. Martin touched her back. Relax. I am relaxed. Your hand is shaking. She looked down. The champagne in her glass trembled. She hated that he noticed. At 7:50, Brielle saw Helen. At first, she thought she was mistaken. Helen stood near the far entrance of the lobby, not inside the ballroom line, but beside a side corridor where hotel staff and private security moved in and out. She wore a deep blue gown with long sleeves and a clean neckline, no heavy jewelry except pearl earrings and a narrow silver bracelet. Her hair was swept back from her face. She looked older than Brielle, of course, but not diminished. That irritated Brielle immediately. Helen should have looked smaller. Abandoned women were supposed to look smaller. Brielle touched Martin's arm. Look. Martin followed her gaze. The change in his face was slight, but Brielle saw it. His eyes fixed on Helen. His jaw shifted. For 1 second, he looked less annoyed than uncertain. Brielle did not like uncertainty. What is she doing here? She asked. Martin's brows drew together. I do not know. Did you invite her? No. Then handle it, he hesitated. That was worse. Brielle set down her champagne and crossed the lobby before Martin could stop her. Helen was speaking with a hotel manager, a tall woman in a black suit who listened with visible respect. Brielle approached with a bright smile and a voice sweet enough to draw attention. Helen. Helen turned. For the first time, Brielle noticed her eyes. They were not sad. That made Brielle's smile sharper. I did not expect to see you here, Brielle said. Are you meeting someone? Yes. How nice. Brielle glanced toward the ballroom. The main entrance is for registered guests. This event is private. I know. Then you understand why this might be awkward. The hotel manager looked at Helen, then at Brielle, her expression cooling. Brielle ignored her. Martin reached them then, moving quickly, but trying not to appear as if he had hurried. Helen, he said under his breath. Why are you here? Helen looked at him. Good evening, Martin. The simple politeness unsettled him more than accusation would have. Brielle stepped closer to him, claiming the visual arrangement. She may be confused, Brielle told the hotel manager. This is an Ashbourne Capital event. Perhaps she came to speak with Martin privately, but this is not the place. The manager's face went completely still. Helen did not rescue Brielle from the mistake. Martin said, Helen, if this is about the divorce, we can discuss it tomorrow. No, Helen said. We cannot. Brielle laughed softly. A few guests had started to look over. Good. Let them look. Helen, really, there is no need to make a scene. Martin has moved on. You should try to do the same with some grace. There it was. The sentence Brielle had been waiting to deliver in public. She lowered her voice, but not enough. A woman your age should understand when the room is no longer hers. Martin's eyes flashed. Brielle. But he did not defend Helen. He never did when it mattered. Helen looked at the young woman in red, at the hand resting possessively on Martin's arm, at the diamond necklace bought with old lies. Then she smiled faintly. You are right about one thing, Helen said. Brielle blinked. I am? A woman should always understand when the room is hers. Before Brielle could answer, the ballroom doors opened. Eleanor Price stepped out. She wore a black evening suit and a silver brooch shaped like a clock hand. Behind her stood 2 security directors and Nolan Mercer, whose face had gone the color of paper. Eleanor crossed the lobby directly toward Helen. Every conversation nearby began to fade. Martin stared at Eleanor as recognition struck him. Managing Counsel, Ashbourne Capital Trust. Eleanor stopped in front of Helen and inclined her head. Miss Moore, she said clearly, loud enough for every guest within 20 feet to hear. The board is ready for you. Brielle's smile froze. Martin did not breathe. Helen adjusted the silver bracelet at her wrist. Thank you, Eleanor. Then she looked at Brielle one last time. Someone moved. The lobby of the Grand Hartwell had been full of controlled voices, polite laughter, and glasses touching softly in expensive hands. Now every sound seemed to withdraw from the air. Brielle looked from Eleanor to Helen, then back again. Miss Moore? She repeated. The name sounded different in her mouth now. Less like a discarded wife. More like a question she was afraid to have answered. Eleanor did not look at her. That was the first punishment. Women like Brielle knew how to fight contempt. They knew how to fight jealousy, gossip, even open insult. What they could not bear was irrelevance. Yes, Eleanor said to Helen. Everyone is waiting. Martin's hand tightened around Brielle's arm. Helen saw it. So did Brielle. The same man who had once stepped between them to protect his mistress now held that mistress in place, as if she might embarrass him further. Helen walked toward the ballroom. The velvet ropes were opened for her. Security stepped aside. The hotel manager lowered her head, with the careful respect reserved for the person paying for every flower, every light, every glass of champagne in the building. Helen entered first. Eleanor followed half a step behind. Martin and Brielle were left standing in the lobby with the guests who had watched the exchange and were now pretending not to stare. Brielle whispered, What is happening? Martin did not answer. He had gone very pale. In the ballroom, 300 guests stood beneath chandeliers and waited for the formal announcement. The stage at the far end was framed by white orchids and a wide screen showing the Ashbourne Capitol seal, a silver clock hand inside a circle. Helen paused just inside the doors. For a second, the size of the room pressed against her. 300 faces, executives, judges, hospital directors, landowners, civic leaders, old money, new money. People Martin had spent years trying to impress. 24 years ago, she would have stepped behind him and smiled. Tonight, there was no one in front of her. Eleanor leaned close. "Breathe once," she murmured. Helen did. One breath. Then she walked. Conversations died row by row as guests turned to see who had entered. Helen did not rush. She did not raise her chin too high or perform grandeur. She simply moved with the calm of a woman who no longer needed permission to occupy space. At the front table, Nolan Mercer stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor. The sound was small, but it cut through the room. Martin heard it from the doorway. He and Brielle had followed, after all. They stood near the back now, frozen just inside the ballroom. Helen reached the stage. The chairman of the Northline Civic Council, a dignified black woman named Ruth Ellison, took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ruth said, her voice steady and warm, "thank you for joining us tonight for the formal launch of the Northline Civic Redevelopment Initiative. Before we discuss the project, we have the privilege of introducing the woman whose family made this work possible." Brielle's breathing quickened. Martin stared at Helen as if his own memory had turned against him. Ruth continued. "For decades, Ashbourne Capital Trust has funded schools, public libraries, rural clinics, housing projects, and legal aid services without public credit. Its founder believed that dignity mattered more than recognition. His name was Arthur Moore." Martin's face changed. Arthur Moore, Helen's father. The clock repairer whose little shop Martin had mocked behind closed doors. The old man with the station wagon. The man Martin once called charmingly useless after one too many drinks at a Christmas party. Ruth looked toward Helen. "After Mr. Moore's passing, stewardship of Ashbourne Capital transferred to his only daughter. She has chosen tonight to step forward not for applause, but for accountability. Please welcome the active director and controlling beneficiary of Ashbourne Capital Trust, Miss Helen Moore." The room rose, not a polite ripple, all at once. 300 people stood because the room understood power before Helen spoke a word. Applause filled the ballroom. It struck Martin like weather. Brielle grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "No," she whispered. But the screen behind Helen changed. Ashbourne Capital Trust, controlling beneficiary, Helen Moore, estimated asset value, $3.3 billion. There was no cruelty in the slide. That made it worse. Facts did not need to shout. Martin looked at the woman on the stage. The woman who had folded his shirts, hosted his clients, kept his house, raised their son, remembered his mother's medication schedule, sent thank you notes to judges' wives, and stayed quiet while he confused her kindness for emptiness. $3.3 billion. The number did not fit inside his understanding of her. That was because his understanding had always been too small. Helen waited until the applause softened. Then she stepped to the microphone. "Good evening," she said. Her voice carried cleanly through the room. "My father repaired clocks for most of his life. People brought him broken things and trusted him to listen closely enough to understand what had stopped moving. He believed money should work the same way, quietly, precisely, in service of time, not vanity." The room listened. Martin could not look away. For years, Ashbourne Capital has remained private. That privacy protected the work. It also protected me. Helen paused. But privacy can become dangerous when the wrong people mistake it for weakness. A slight movement went through the guests. Nolan Mercer shut his eyes. He knew. Martin knew he knew. Brielle did not understand yet, but she sensed the floor vanishing beneath her heels. Helen continued. "Tonight, Ashbourne Capital will announce the Northline Civic Redevelopment Initiative. It will include a children's hospital wing, senior housing, a transportation center, and a public library funded in perpetuity by responsible commercial development." Soft applause. Helen let it pass. But before we celebrate, we must be clear about who will not be part of this project. Martin's body went rigid. Brielle whispered, Martin? Helen looked down at the first row, then toward the back of the room. Not dramatically, directly. Ashbourne Capital has completed an internal review of several advisory proposals. As of tonight, Vale, Mercer, and Klein has been removed from consideration for all Northline legal contracts. The room froze. Nolan Mercer's face collapsed into gray anger. Martin felt Brielle's nails dig into his sleeve. Helen's expression did not change. This decision follows evidence that individuals connected to the firm attempted to obtain access to privately held land through undisclosed marital pressure, improper confidentiality clauses, and a proposed waiver that would have harmed the rightful owner without informed consent. Every word was measured. No names, no shouting. Enough detail to make everyone turn. They turned. First toward Nolan, then toward Martin, then toward Brielle in her red dress. Brielle's lips parted. She suddenly looked very young. Not innocent, just unprepared. Martin took one step forward, then stopped. There was nowhere to go. The aisle felt longer than a courtroom, and this time he was not the attorney controlling the questions. Helen turned one page on the lectern. Ashbourne Capital will also be forwarding relevant documentation to Independent Ethics Counsel. Any professional relationship involving concealed conflicts, marital coercion, or misuse of client development funds will be reviewed outside this room. Nolan moved first. He stood, buttoned his jacket with shaking hands, and turned toward Martin. You told me it was handled, he said. The words were not loud, but everyone near them heard. Martin's throat worked. Nolan, this is not the place. No, Nolan said. This is exactly the place. You made sure it was. Brielle clutched Martin's arm. What does he mean? Martin shook her off. The movement was small. To Brielle, it was enormous. The thing was not finished. Ruth Ellison returned to the stage with a formal folder. Behind her, the screen changed again, this time showing architectural renderings of the Northline project. Wide windows, clean brick, sunlight over a children's hospital garden. A library built around a central reading room. The audience tried to recover itself. Rich people liked order. Public scandal offended them, less than visible disorder. Helen gave them order. She introduced the hospital director, then the transit planner, then the architect selected for the public library and senior housing. Daniel Reed walked onto the stage in a midnight blue suit. He was 51, broad-shouldered, with dark blonde hair going silver at the edges, and the steady gaze of a man who built things meant to outlast applause. Helen had met him 6 weeks earlier during project review. He had disagreed with her twice in the first meeting, listened carefully when she explained why he was wrong once, and laughed when she proved it with his own site drawings. She respected him immediately. That had been a strange, clean feeling. Respect without performance. Daniel did not look at her like a rescued woman. He looked at her like a person with a difficult mind worth meeting properly. As he crossed the stage, Martin noticed the way Helen's shoulders eased. It hit him harder than the money. Money could be explained. Hidden inheritance, legal structures, old land. But that small softening in her face when Daniel came near her, that was not money. That was absence. The absence of fear. Daniel shook Ruth's hand, then Helen's. His thumb touched Helen's knuckle for less than a second. Martin saw it. Brielle saw Martin seeing it. Who is he? She hissed. Martin did not answer. On stage, Daniel took the microphone. When Miss Moore first reviewed my proposal, he said, she told me the library looked impressive, but did not look loved. I disagreed for about 12 minutes. Then I realized she was right. Soft laughter moved through the room. Helen smiled despite herself. Daniel continued, a public building should never make ordinary people feel like visitors to someone else's power. Ms. Moore insisted every space in Northline be designed around the people who will use it when no one important is watching. That is rare. It is also the reason this project will matter. Applause followed. Brielle looked at Helen's smile and felt something sharp twist inside her. She had spent months imagining Helen as a woman Martin had outgrown, a faded wife, a quiet obstacle, someone whose best years had already been used by someone else. But the woman on stage did not look used. She looked witnessed. And the man beside her was not trying to possess that light. He was standing in it carefully. That was worse than beauty. Beauty could be competed with. Peace could not. When the formal remarks ended, guests surged toward Helen. They congratulated her, asked questions, offered respect. Some offered apologies for never knowing. Helen accepted each with grace and a memory for names that made people straighten with pleasure. Martin remained near the back wall. His phone vibrated again and again. Messages from partners, from clients, from Nolan. One from the firm's general counsel. Call me now. Another from Brielle's mentor. What happened? Martin did not open them. Brielle did. She had taken his phone from his hand without asking, because until 10 minutes earlier she still believed they were a team. Her face drained as she read. They are blaming me, she said. Martin looked at her blankly. They are saying my expenses triggered the review, the hotel records, the client dinners. Martin, tell them you approved everything. He closed his eyes. Martin. Not now. Not now. Her voice rose. My career is on fire, and you are staring at your wife. Several guests looked over. Martin opened his eyes slowly. Lower your voice. Brielle gave a small, disbelieving laugh. You promised me partnership. I promised you I would try. No. You said once Helen signed, everything would be clean. The sentence landed too clearly. 3 people turned. Nolan Mercer, standing 10 feet away, heard every word. His mouth went hard. Martin seized Brielle's elbow and pulled her toward a side corridor. Stop talking. She pulled back. Do not touch me like I am the problem. Right now, you are. The words slapped the color from her face. Helen heard none of it. Or rather, she heard enough and chose not to turn. After 9, Martin found Helen near the side terrace 20 minutes later. The winter air beyond the glass doors had misted the edges with cold. Inside, the ballroom glowed gold and white. Helen stood with a glass of water in one hand, while Daniel Reed spoke with a hospital trustee nearby. Eleanor remained within sight, as she always did now. Martin approached carefully. For the first time in their marriage, he looked like a man asking permission to enter his wife's life. Helen. Daniel stopped speaking. Helen turned. Her face did not harden. That almost destroyed him. If she had hated him, he could have held on to the idea that she was still tied to him by something. But her calm was not hatred. It was distance. Martin, she said. He glanced at Daniel. Daniel looked back without aggression. He did not need to claim ground that was not his. He simply stood close enough that Helen would not be alone, unless she chose it. Martin swallowed. May I speak with you? Eleanor stepped closer. Helen raised one hand slightly. It is all right. Martin hated that she could say that now. All right, as if he were a manageable inconvenience. They moved a few steps away. Not far. Helen would not give him privacy inside a room he had helped turn into evidence. You should have told me, Martin said. Helen looked at him. For one wild second he heard himself and almost stopped, but fear made him continue. About your father. About Ashbourne. About all of this. We were married for 24 years. Yes, Helen said. We were. I had a right to know. Something in her eyes changed then. Not anger. Recognition. He had said the thing that revealed him completely. You had 24 years to know me, she said. Martin's face tightened. That is not the same. It is exactly the same. Helen, please. His voice cracked on the word, and several people nearby looked over. He lowered it quickly. I made mistakes. I know that. What happened with Brielle was wrong. What happened with Brielle? He flinched. She tilted her head. That makes it sound like weather, like a storm moved through and no one chose anything. I chose badly. You chose repeatedly. He shut his mouth. She had never spoken to him like this. Not because she had lacked the words, he realized, because she had once loved him enough to spare him accuracy. I was lonely, he said. Helen's expression did not move. So was I. The words were quiet. They were devastating. Martin looked down. I did not know. No, she said. You did not ask. He dragged one hand over his face. His composure was breaking in pieces now. He had won difficult trials with less preparation than he had for this apology, but nothing sounded right because the truth had no flattering angle. Helen, I can fix this. She almost smiled. What part? Us. There is no us. There can be again. No. The word was soft and immediate. Martin stared at her. No? No. After 24 years, you can just say no? Helen looked at him for a long moment. After 24 years, you brought a woman into my dining room and asked me to pour her a drink. His face crumpled. There it was. No speech could outrun that image. The table. The candles. Brielle in her chair. Martin's hand pushing the pen forward. I am sorry, he whispered. I believe you. Hope flashed in his eyes, bright and desperate. Helen let it live for 1 second, because cruelty had never interested her. Then she ended it. But regret is not repair, and forgiveness is not an invitation. Martin's breathing turned uneven. Helen, please. He reached for her hand. She stepped back. That small movement did what a scream could not. It told him her body no longer belonged to his history. Around them, the room had gone quiet again. Not fully, but enough. Martin seemed to notice the watching faces. The partners. The clients. Brielle near the corridor, white-faced and shaking. Daniel, still near the terrace, his expression controlled but alert. Something in Martin broke open. He lowered himself to one knee. Gasps moved through the room. Helen closed her eyes briefly. Not from pain, from exhaustion. Martin, she said. I was wrong. His voice was raw now. I was wrong about you, about our life, about what mattered. I humiliated you. I lied to you. I tried to take what was yours. I do not deserve another chance, but I am asking for one. Brielle made a small sound from the corridor. Helen did not look at her. Martin looked up with wet eyes. Please, Helen. The room waited. Years ago, Helen might have mistaken this moment for justice. A man on his knees, the other woman watching, the public seeing her worth at last. But as she looked down at Martin, she felt no triumph. Only clarity. Stand up, she said. He shook his head. Not until you answer. Then here is my answer. Stand up, because I will not let you turn my peace into another performance. His face twisted. Slowly, he stood. Helen's voice remained gentle. I loved you when you had nothing but ambition and one good suit. I loved you when you failed. I loved you when no one in those rooms knew your name. I loved you so well that you mistook my love for proof that I had no power. Martin's eyes filled again. You did not leave because I was small, she said. You left because making me small made you feel larger. No one moved. Brielle covered her mouth. Helen took a breath. You did not lose me tonight, Martin. You lost me at that table. Tonight you only found out what losing me costs. Then she turned and walked away. Minutes later, he stood beside a service entrance, one hand braced against the wall, breathing as if he had run miles. His bow tie hung loose. His hair had fallen across his forehead. The powerful attorney who had walked into the gala expecting applause now looked like a man waiting for a sentence. Brielle stopped several feet away. We need to leave, she said. He laughed once. It was not a laugh. It was the sound a man made when there was no language left. Martin, she snapped. Listen to me. We need a strategy. He looked at her then. Really looked. She was still beautiful. The red dress still fit perfectly. The diamonds still flashed at her throat. But now all he could see was the dining room. Brielle in Helen's chair. Brielle drinking from Helen's glass. Brielle smiling while he pushed papers at the woman who had built his life. The ugliness had not been in Brielle alone. It had been in him. A strategy, he repeated. Yes. Nolan is going to protect the firm. They will try to pin this on us. On me. You need to tell them the expenses were authorized. You need to tell them Helen is retaliating because she is jealous. Martin stared. Jealous? Yes, obviously. She is angry you chose me. Something cold moved through his face. I did not choose you, he said. Brielle went still. What? He swallowed. His eyes were red, but his voice steadied in a way that frightened her. I chose myself. You were just the mirror that made it look attractive. The words hit her harder than an insult. How dare you? Brielle. No. Do not do this now. Do not turn noble because your wife turned out to be rich. He flinched because part of it was true. Not all, but enough. Brielle stepped closer, voice low and shaking. You told me she was nothing. You told me she was tired and plain and grateful. You told me the estate was old family clutter. You told me once she signed, Northline would be ours. Martin closed his eyes. Down the corridor, Nolan Mercer appeared. He had heard enough. Thank you, Miss Stone, Nolan said. Brielle spun around. Nolan held up his phone. Its screen glowed with an active recording. Her face went empty. Martin stared at him. Nolan, the executive committee meets at 8 tomorrow morning, Nolan said. You will both receive formal notice before midnight. You cannot record us, Brielle said, panic sharpening her voice. Nolan smiled without warmth. This is a hotel corridor at an event where half the guests are holding phones. I would worry less about admissibility and more about survival. He looked at Martin. You are suspended pending review. Do not enter the office. Do not contact clients. Do not contact staff. If you still have firm property, return it through counsel. Martin looked as if the floor had opened. Nolan, after 20 years? After tonight, Nolan said. Yes. Then he turned to Brielle. As for you, partner track is no longer under discussion. Brielle's mouth opened, but no sound came. Nolan walked away. The corridor lights hummed softly overhead. Brielle turned back to Martin. The tenderness she had performed for months was gone now. What remained was fury stripped of costume. Fix it, she said. Martin looked at her. I cannot. You mean you will not? I mean I cannot. Then what was the point of you? There it was. The truth, clean and bright as a blade. Martin almost smiled. He had left Helen for a woman who saw him exactly the way he had seen Helen. Useful until inconvenient. Brielle grabbed her clutch. I am not going down for your midlife crisis. It was not a crisis, Martin said quietly. It was a choice. Then enjoy it. She walked out through the service corridor, red dress flashing under fluorescent lights, diamonds trembling at her throat. This or 11. By morning, the gala was everywhere that mattered, not in tabloids. Helen's team had no interest in feeding gossip. But in legal circles, development circles, donor circles, and every private breakfast where powerful people discussed who had lost access to whom, the story moved faster than print. Ashbourne Capital's hidden director had stepped forward. Vale, Mercer, and Klein had been removed from Northline. Martin Valet had been suspended. Brielle Stone's partner candidacy had vanished before sunrise. At 8:30, Martin sat alone in his apartment and watched rain slide down the window glass. His phone lay face down on the table. He had stopped answering. For years, he had believed status was structure. Firm name, corner office, invitations, people turning when he entered. Now all those things had collapsed in less than 12 hours, and the silence underneath was not noble or tragic. It was ordinary. That was what frightened him. Without the room, without the applause, without Helen smoothing the edges of his life before he entered it, he was just a man in a wrinkled shirt staring at cold coffee. He opened a drawer and found an old photograph. Helen at 32, holding their son Lucas on her hip in the backyard. Martin stood beside her in a cheap suit, laughing at something outside the frame. Helen looked tired, happy, completely present. He could not remember who had taken the picture. He could remember the day, though. He had lost a case that week, his first major loss. He had come home furious, convinced his career was over. Helen had listened for 2 hours, then put Lucas to bed, made soup, and sat beside him on the porch until midnight. He had forgotten that. No. Worse. He had used it, then forgotten it. His phone buzzed. Brielle. He let it ring. Then Eleanor Price's office called. He answered because fear still had manners. The divorce would proceed. Full disclosure would be required. Any attempt to conceal marital assets would trigger immediate court action. The Ashbourne estate was not part of his claim. Helen would not pursue public defamation if he cooperated with the ethics review. If he did not, the documentation would speak for itself. Documentation. The word sounded like Helen now. Quiet, complete, patient. He hung up and sat there for a long time. Then he said aloud to the empty apartment, "I did this." No one contradicted him. 3 weeks later, Brielle resigned, before the firm could terminate her. She sent Martin one final text. "You ruined me." He stared at it for almost a minute. Then he typed back, "No, we mistook cruelty for ambition." She never responded. He did not expect her to. The divorce finalized in late spring. Helen arrived at court in a pale gray suit with Eleanor at her side. Martin came alone. He looked older. Not ruined exactly, but reduced to his true size. When the judge confirmed the final decree, Martin turned to Helen. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not an accusation. Not quite. Helen considered the question. Happiness had become complicated in the months after the gala. There had been satisfaction, yes. Relief. Occasional grief that arrived without warning while she was washing a cup, or passing the restaurant where she and Martin once celebrated their 10th anniversary. Freedom did not erase history. It simply stopped history from driving. "I am honest," she said. Martin nodded slowly. For once, he seemed to understand that this was more than 12. 1 year after the gala, the Northline Children's Wing opened under a sky so blue it looked almost staged. Helen stood near the entrance in a cream coat, watching families enter the building for the first public tour. Children ran ahead of parents. Nurses pointed toward bright murals. A little boy pressed both palms to the glass wall of the garden and shouted that he could see fish in the pond. Arthur Moore would have loved that. Not the ribbon, not the speeches, the fish. Daniel Reed stood beside Helen with his hands in his coat pockets. "You are thinking about your father," he said. Helen glanced at him. "How do you know?" "You get very quiet when something matters." "I used to get quiet when something hurt." "I know." He did not say it with pity. That was why she could bear it. Daniel had become part of her life slowly. No grand rescue, no dramatic replacement. He came through architecture, then conversation, then dinners that started with project notes and ended with laughter in her kitchen. He learned that Helen hated red roses because Martin had sent them after forgetting apologies. So he brought her white tulips once, then stopped bringing flowers unless he saw something strange and beautiful at a market. He never asked her to be easier. He never confused calm with consent. Months after the divorce, when he first kissed her on the front steps of her house, he had paused before touching her face. "Is this all right?" he asked. Helen had almost cried then. Not because the question was dramatic, because it was simple. Because she had forgotten how much dignity lived inside being asked. Now he looked toward the hospital doors. "Arthur Moore Children's Wing," Daniel said. "Good name." Helen smiled. He would have complained, of course. Then he would have secretly visited every week. Daniel laughed. Lucas arrived a few minutes later. Helen's son was 23 now, tall like Martin, but with her father's patient eyes. He had been angry after the gala. Not at Helen. At the years no one could give back to her. At his father. At himself for not seeing more. Helen had told him the truth carefully. "You are not responsible for what your father chose," she said. Lucas had looked at her across the kitchen table, with tears standing in his eyes. "Neither were you." That sentence had stayed with her. Now Lucas hugged her tightly in front of the new hospital wing. "Grandpa would have liked this," he said. "The fish most of all." Lucas grinned. "Definitely the fish." Across the courtyard, Eleanor Price stood with Ruth Ellison and several board members, looking satisfied in the restrained way of attorneys who had spent a year making sure every signature sat exactly where it should. The ribbon ceremony began. Helen gave a short speech. She did not mention Martin. She did not mention Brielle. Not because she was protecting them. Because they no longer belonged in the center of her story. My father believed broken things deserved attention, Helen told the crowd. He repaired clocks, but he also repaired futures in the quiet ways he could. This building is for every family who has ever sat in a waiting room and needed the world to be kinder. May it be useful. May it be warm. May it remind every person who enters that dignity should never depend on wealth, age, marriage, or someone else's permission. Applause rose into the clear air. Helen stepped back. Daniel touched her hand, not to claim her, to ask if she wanted the contact. She turned her palm into his. At the edge of the crowd, unseen by most, Martin stood beneath a bare maple tree. He had not been invited by Helen. The public opening was open to everyone. He looked thinner. His suit was good but not new. His hair had more gray now. He watched Helen accept congratulations, watched Lucas stand beside her, watched Daniel offer her a cup of coffee, and then step back when a donor approached. Martin did not interrupt. For once, he did not mistake wanting access for deserving it. He stayed until Helen looked across the courtyard and saw him. Their eyes met. He nodded once, not a plea, not a performance, an acknowledgement. Helen returned the nod. Then she turned back to her son. Martin walked away. That was the final gift she gave him. Not forgiveness. He already had that. Release. That evening, Helen returned home to the Ashbourne estate. The house Martin had tried to steal through a clause had become her center again. The old rooms were no longer heavy with memory. They had been painted, repaired, open to light. The dining room table remained, but Helen had changed the chairs. All of them. Some symbols deserved practical treatment. Lucas came for dinner. Daniel cooked with confidence and very little accuracy. Eleanor stopped by with papers and stayed for soup. They laughed too loudly in the kitchen while rain tapped gently against the windows. Later, after everyone left, Helen stood alone in the dining room. The table was set for no occasion at all. Just dinner. Just life. She thought of the night Martin brought Brielle into this room. The cold chicken, the divorce papers, the wine poured down the sink. She remembered the feeling of her hand on the empty glass, the strange stillness in her chest, the certainty that something had ended. She had been right. But endings were often misunderstood. Some endings were not walls. Some were doors finally closing behind people who never deserved to enter the next room. Helen turned off the dining room light and walked toward the kitchen, where Daniel was badly humming while washing dishes, where Lucas had left his jacket over a chair, where Eleanor's forgotten reading glasses sat on the counter. It was not perfect. It was hers. And that was better than perfect. The woman Martin thought was too old, too quiet, too ordinary to keep, had not become powerful at the gala. She had always been powerful. The gala only forced everyone else to catch up. If this story held your attention, stay close for more stories about quiet women, public betrayal, hidden power, and the moment the people who underestimated them finally understand the cost.